Hello. All right. So we're going to be getting started in a moment here. So we'll give folks an opportunity to come into the sanctuary and get situated. Hello to all the folks joining us from live stream as well. All right, so as you all know, we were sort of switching the agenda a little bit, so we'll be saving our discussion on Jude until next week. But for today, we thought it'd be helpful to be able to hear from some of the men and encouragement to hear from some of the men who went to the Weekender. But before we directly dive into that, I'm hoping to ground our time in some scriptures. So if you can take your Bibles and turn to Ephesians 4 with me. Ephesians 4, and we will read verses 1 through 6. It says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, and through all, and in all. I just wanted to maybe start off with some scriptures because when we hear about these conferences or these weekenders, I think it can be easy to be enamored with ministries and churches like Nine Marks or Ligonier or Grace Community Church, TMS. And they are faithful ministries that have borne a lot of fruit, and we've seen their far-reaching success in those things. And there comes a sense of validation with maybe aligning yourselves to, oh, this is like the Nine Marks way of doing things, or this is the Grace Community Church way of doing things. But we also need to remember that our church is called to a very specific context, and it's made up of very specific people, namely all of you. And that may necessitate that our ministries will look different than these. We have different people, we have different giftedness because we have different people. There's a different cultural context that we minister in, that, let's say, a Capitol Hill Baptist Church would not necessarily minister in that particular culture. And our church is at a different stage as far as maturity and the overall life cycle and life stage of a church. But even though we have all of these differences, it doesn't mean that we don't have the same God, the same Father, the same Son, and the same Holy Spirit. It doesn't mean that we don't have the same gospel, and it doesn't mean that we don't have the same scriptures. We have all of those things in common. And because we have all of those things in common, many of the principles that you see from all of these different ministries that strive to be faithful to Christ and be faithful to His Word, you're going to see similarities there. Things that will be consistent. Now, some of these things may be applied a little bit differently between ministries based on the specific context that they're in, but those things are still present. So the men that I'll call up here, Garrett, Steve, and Teddy, I'll ask you to make your way up here, have been able to consider these things from the context of the Nine Marks ministry and the ministry at Capitol Hill Baptist Church. So we thought it'd be a good opportunity to share the things that they learned from this past week. So, go ahead and pass out some mics if you could pass that down. All right, so maybe we can start with just a little bit of a recap as far as what is a Nine Marks Weekender, what is its purpose, and what did you all do? So if you could just give the folks a sense of just what happened over the few days that you were there. Maybe Garrett, we can have you give a recap of that, and you guys can fill in if there's anything that you want to fill in there.
Yeah, so it's I would say pretty different than other conferences. It's much more of like a workshops, interaction, observation, and you're just kind of like seeing what they do a little bit. And kind of just participating in the life of the church for a weekend. There was a lot of kind of talks about, I would say, centered a lot on philosophy of ministry, things that are related to ecclesiology, like word-centered ministry, membership and discipline, leadership, singing, a lot of things like that, discipleship. And then, so a lot of talks like that over the course of, Thursday night to Monday morning. And then a lot of, in addition to the kind of talks and sessions, there's sitting in on one of their elders meetings, which was kind of crazy. You're like a little bit like, oh, like feel like you don't belong there. But they're very gracious, and that was a good experience. Sitting in, like attending Sunday morning worship, Sunday evening worship, members meeting, and Sunday evening they have kind of like a encouragement and feedback session of just kind of like how the day went with the like leadership, the elders and pastors there. Anyone who is involved in like the Sunday services, they do that to, what did they say? Grow in giving and receiving godly encouragement, and giving and receiving godly criticism or feedback. And so they kind of just talk about the services, how it went. Yeah, that's, I guess, a little bit of like the recap. It's smaller than like a normal conference. So like Shepherd's Conference is whatever, 5,000, 6,000 people. This is like a couple hundred pastors from mostly kind of like East Coast, South. Yeah, so there's a lot of also interaction, and you kind of get to know some people over the course of the weekend.
Yeah, that's awesome. Steve, Teddy, anything to add to that as far as what you did over that time?
Well, maybe you can talk about what we did, like, together. I don't know, like we ate breakfast together, like what our days were like.
You had your own conference over there? And
Yeah, I mean, we were with Pastor Mark, who was very intentional about making sure we have check-ins or touch points throughout, and have opportunities to debrief, share observations, ask questions. So that was really helpful, especially just to get his insights and kind of ask him, why things are a certain way, why do they do what they do. So yeah, definitely thankful for Pastor Mark's leadership. I guess, yeah, I mean, a couple of the basic details. This was in Washington, D.C. The church that this all happened in is called Capitol Hill Bible Church. It's like a 100-year-old church, or over 100 years old. And it's right in the middle of Capitol Hill. So it's like a block away from the Supreme Court and what's the Capitol building? I don't even know what these buildings are called, but it's like a lot of government things. And then, but the actual weekend is hosted by a ministry called Nine Marks Ministry, which is a parachurch ministry, but its sort of focus is to really promote the just ecclesiology, like the foundational truths of what the local church is and why it's so important to Christ and to the Christian. And when we get there, they tell us, "You're here to observe." And so literally, like, the architecture of the church is like, imagine we're all here together, but there's a balcony, and it kind of like surrounds the sanctuary. And so we're all sitting on the balcony, and we're all just watching everything kind of play out in the church, like literally. So like in my mind, I kind of like think about, like, I'm not a doctor, but I've seen lots of TV shows, and they're like, the residents will like watch people doing surgery like through the glass. So it was sort of like that. So it was a pretty cool experience.
Yeah, I think it was the weekender itself was definitely that mix of you're like a fly in the wall, just kind of watching their church interact and operate. So, as Steve was mentioning, yeah, in the balcony, deliberately during their elders meeting, during their membership class, during their members meeting, and kind of seeing all those different segments of their church in operation, and also behind the scenes of how the leaders operated. But then those would be followed up by their staff kind of interacting with us and engaging us. Like, all right, this is maybe some teachings, but then also conversation of any questions that we had or any at a group level. And then also there was an opportunity to have lunch also with some of them on a smaller scale too, to have those more intimate conversations. And so there was a lot of different levels of interaction that was available there. And as Steve mentioned, it was also not just a blessing that individually we would go and have those times to interact with the 9 Mark staff, but then as a church, we got to practice that ourselves and having that time, not just with Pastor Mark, but with one another, just making sure, or having the opportunity to practice growing in unity in Christ together. And that was a great blessing as well.
Thanks, guys, for describing that for us. And yeah, I agree. I think there was just a helpful aspect of being able to interact and, chat with the people there and get a sense of getting to know one another. Whereas like as a Shepherd's Conference, with 5,000 people, you're not really going to get that to the same degree. It's more about like, okay, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to absorb these messages and workshops and whatever. But there you get to know the folks that are around you and get to know their ministry and all of that. So that was very, very encouraging. So in what ways did you observe that the 9 Marks ministry or Capitol Hill itself is different than what we do here at Lighthouse? And also, what ways do you perceive that things are similar? And I'm not necessarily asking for, okay, this way is better over there or this way is better over here, but just purely observationally, what are some of the differences and similarities that you guys notice? Maybe we can just go down the line.
Yeah, so I think one of the things they actually talked about that Kevin kind of mentioned early is right at the beginning, they basically kind of said, like, the point of this is not to basically take everything you see here and just copy it and do it at your church. They made this distinction between elements and forms, which is basically what Kevin said earlier. It's like the core principles, like preaching the Bible, prayer, membership, meaningful membership, baptism. Like these are like elements, like singing, like and praise that like constitute what a church is and what a church does. But the forms are kind of how it looks, the way that it's done in the church, and like the way that it's implemented. So a lot, like the elements are there, like we do the same things that are the most important things, but there are stuff that looks different. Maybe one of the biggest things that I think they emphasize a lot is their church polity is congregational. So they'll talk about it as elder-led congregationalism, which is kind of where the authority rests in the congregation as a kind of declarative authority rests in the members. So the members themselves basically like they take votes on everything. So that looks different than us. At the same time, I think there's still maybe a similarity is a high degree of trust, respect, submission to the elders of the church. So I observed that for sure, even watching the members' meetings, them interact with their elders, a real high degree of like trust and submission there. There's other things, but I'll let these guys talk about those. It
was a helpful distinction between the elements and forms. I guess, in terms of one of the forms, I think that sort of stood out to me was in the elders meeting. You really saw sort of the Washington, D.C. DNA coming through. And I think Kevin and I were talking about this earlier, but there's 25 elders, they're sitting around the table. and the way they kind of proceed through. They definitely do some of the devotional things, like they talk about what's going on with certain members. They pray through the member role. One of the elders gave an update on personal evangelism because they want to hold each other accountable. So he talked about different people in his life that he's talking to, in his workplace, these things, super encouraging. But as they kind of go into the business of the church, they bring things like motions, which are like long memos that they share with each other before the elders meeting. Everybody's responsible and accountable to read through those, have a point of view, and then come and discuss and then vote. And then there's this chairperson that kind of facilitates a vote. So they say ayes, and then they give ayes, they noes. So it's almost like watching C-SPAN and watching like a Congress meeting. And it's just interesting to think about because, it's a 100-year-old church. And those are the people that are in the church, is like the same people that are running a lot of these meetings in Congress and the Senate. So you really see that DNA coming through. And I think this is clearly, it's a form. It's not like this is how it should be run. But it's neat just to see how people kind of bring their gifts, their unique gifts in that context and use it to edify the church. I don't think we have a lot of government people in our body necessarily, but there's unique gifts that we have in our body, and it's kind of interesting to think about how can those help, just edify one another in the context of the church. How can we use those things to serve and to build each other up? So it's interesting to think about that, and then fast forward like 100 years, and like you really see the fruit of that, how that really helps facilitate efficient meetings, help the elders really save time, run efficient meetings, and make really good decisions and things of that nature. So that's definitely something that I observed that was different, not necessarily good or bad.
And sure, just to add on, as a congregation, but also eldership, they're a younger church, even though the church building has been there 100 years, even though the ministry of Mark Dever has been there maybe 30 years. Their average age is maybe not very different than us, maybe even younger. A lot of young people, a lot of their elders are maybe in their mid-30s. And so it was just very interesting to observe that. Additionally, they do a lot of, as Steve mentioned, they do a lot of handouts, memos and handouts. So their morning service, their bulletin was also included, all of their songs in basically hymns, written out, all the lyrics, all the music, so that everybody can sing along. There's the members meeting, everybody got a pamphlet printed out for them to follow through as they went through the members meeting. Similar to the elders, their pamphlets were maybe 200 pages long, and so everything is like printed out there so everybody can be on the same page together. So there's a big emphasis upon being together and being orderly. I think might have been mentioned before, not only a congregationalism in terms of polity, like how they govern themselves, how they make decisions, but then also there's a big emphasis upon the one another's. And so we would have that as well, but they would practice that with emphasis upon congregational singing in particular. So the stage presence was much simpler for them. They just had a piano, maybe a guitar or two, and then few singers, and so that was it, and they relied upon that. But what you would hear is basically 500 plus people singing or so.
There's good acoustics in the building.
Yeah, they were also all facing each other. So as you were singing, they would all be turning around side to side, looking each other in the face as they're singing like full volume, which definitely was a different experience. But it was wonderful. You'd hear people singing, no matter to the praise of the Lord. Some in parts and some in different parts.
I sang all of the parts.
Gotta be careful who you sit next to on a Sunday.
But it was very interesting, but just such a great blessing as well. Because as they mentioned, you can imagine there's a balcony, in a circular fashion, and then also a floor in a circular fashion, almost circular fashion. So wherever you look, you're staring at somebody. And so that was not only present during the congregational singing, but then also during their just time together. But even despite all those maybe on the surface differences, there's just a lot of similarities, just highlighting again the primacy of the word in preaching, just the just to care to consider membership, take membership seriously. So we saw them debate in a good way during the elders meeting, just how to care for the members of the church and how they would consider that and how they would even present that in such a way that would edify and encourage the congregation. And then we got to see them not only talk about that in the elders meeting, but then actually do that during the membership meeting. And then in such a way that as they presented that, they then, the congregation had a chance to engage the elders in real time during their meeting. And then during the service review, that's what Garrett was referring to, when they basically look back upon everything that happened as a church among the elders and the pastors, they got to reassess, like, hey, how did we do in that? Were we effective? Were we faithful to Christ and going through all those things? So just a common theme of care for the members in a manner that glorifies Christ. I think in our DNA, same things might be practiced a little bit different, but similar and different in the same way.
Yeah, and even though our church isn't the same as far as a congregational rule church, what I do appreciate about Capitol Hill and Nine Marks is that you can see that congregationalism throughout their entire ministry, and you see in the singing, you see in the way they conduct their services, you see in the way they run their elders meetings, that is really something that's made its way through and permeated all that they do, because they believe it, and they believe it from the Word, and that's why it informs all that they do. So I do really appreciate that aspect of things. You know, something else that you mentioned, Teddy, context also kind of makes things different in terms of how it looks. You mentioned that even though it's a 100-year-old church, the membership and also the eldership is fairly young. And we see that just because it's a fairly transient congregation. You have people moving into DC for work and kind of going through there, doing their stint, and then within 3 or 4 years, they're gone. And that's just the nature of the work that they do. So you're going to see a lot of turnover in the membership. I forget what the statistic is as far as how the average membership is in the church. I think it was only like 3-4 years or something like that, or maybe even less than that, just because you have so many people kind of cycling through. And that's going to inform some of the ways that the ministry looks different, and that includes just the relative youth of the congregation there. So a lot of good observations that you guys made. Were there any universal principles, and we talk about the things that the forms may be different, but the principles, and the elements are the same. What universal principles did you learn that either just reinforce the convictions that you already have, or maybe even shed some new light on and reinform certain things that you may have held before?
One thing that I think I came away with and was more reinforced is, as we think about, one of the things you said when you were talking about congregationalism, how for them, it's very impactful, like it makes its way out into things, and everything was intentional and had a purpose. It's not just because. I think when we think about what we do as a church, and we're going to say, hey, we're going to do it like this. This is the form that it's, the shape that it's going to take place in. That can become really legalistic. Just like for them, it could become really legalistic because they have strong opinions on things like on how it looks. The thing that guards us is a really thick gospel and being connected to Christ in both places, right? So things may look differently, but the important thing is, and even as we think about, hey, what can we kind of bring back? What can we work on as a church? The thing that's really important is that Christ is at the center of it and his word and the gospel. Otherwise, we're just kind of stapling on things and it's like, it's for the wrong reasons, and then it becomes a legalistic thing. That was, I think, one of the important things that stood out to me, and something that, I'm sure these guys will talk about stuff. We'll talk about stuff that we might want to, grow in. That will be like the kind of foundational principle.
Yeah, I mean, I echo that. I think, just kind of even going back to like thinking about some of the similarities, I think that was one similarity that stood out to me through the weekend is just the level of intentionality that they aspire to in terms of tying what they're doing to what they believe in the Word of God. And that's something I appreciate about our church and our elders as well. And despite kind of the difference in the polity, like, congregation rule versus elder rule, like one thing I appreciate about our elders is they're not heavy-handed with their decision-making. Like I know that, they've waited for many things in the church before they start things, programs, move in certain directions, and that's for the benefit of bringing the church along and letting them know what's going on. And so that's something that I really appreciate. I think something else that kind of stood out to me, or maybe was reinforced, I'd say, and I'm biased because I'm involved in youth ministry, so one of the things that Mark Dever did was he had the group stand up and he went through this exercise of sit down if you were saved at 5 years old, sit down if you were saved at 7 years old, and then people slowly would start sitting down, and by the time he got to, I think 15, most of the room had sat down. And the point he was making was that he says he does this in many different groups, not just the Weekender, but he does it in conferences, he does it in his church, other churches, and it's pretty much that's how it plays out. And the point he's making is that many people that are saved get saved while they're in their youth. Many of them are many of them are children. And more likely than not, that's happening in children's ministries, in local churches. And so he's saying, children's ministry shouldn't be an afterthought. It's not babysitting. Same for youth, but it really should be something that we think about as a missions field. These are groups of unbelievers that are in our church, that are in our body, and they are a captive audience, and we have the privilege of sharing the gospel with them on a regular basis, and we should take that seriously. So it was just neat to kind of see that exercise.
Yeah, I think one of the underlying universal themes that stood out to me was just that this was just an ordinary church with ordinary people in it, and recipients of the ordinary means of grace. Yeah. I mean, that was just so powerful because that's really the foundation of everything that they did. Yes, maybe the form or the practice maybe was specific to their church, but then it informed, for example, that with ordinary means of grace, that what that's referring to there is just the preaching of the word, the teaching of the word, seeing the word displayed in each other's lives, praying for one another in the word. The
sacraments, the ordinances.
Discipling, ordinances, all that they did, all relied upon just, trusting what the Lord gives forth for, believers in his word. And that held everything together. That was the engine behind the terminology, meaningful membership, is that their members would then, that was the motivation for their members to do what they did and not kind of sit back, for example. That was the motivation behind why they should be united and and the emphasis that they would have upon one another's. That was the why behind, why they would treat sin seriously, because that's what divides or that's what separates people from the Lord. And so just ordinary church was really referring to just the simplicity of the gospel in every part of life.
Thanks for sharing, guys. So as far as you guys having spent the time over there and having time with one another discussing these things, I'm sure you guys discussed in what ways can our church grow, right? Or there are many things that they are doing well and many things that we may overlook and blind spots that our own church may have. Were there any things that you guys identified during your time there that key takeaways that we could apply in our church, in our local church context?
Let's go the opposite way this time. Teddy, start.
Okay, so building upon the ordinary means of grace then, I think just as a key takeaway, there's one of the things that they did that just stood out that I think is just a way that we can grow as a church, is they practiced that in particular in prayer. They prayed often, and it didn't mean that they prayed super long. There is a place for that, and I'm sure in terms of different contexts, they would do that as well. But what we saw on display is they prayed briefly. They prayed faithfully. They prayed often, and I think that was just a great takeaway that our church can grow in. Maybe another one that I would highlight as well is they highlighted just faithfulness and just recounting God's faithfulness in all things. One, and in particular, when they were thinking about the history of that church, they told basically a testimony of how that church had started, how the church building was built was basically two little girls were helping bring bricks to help build that building, and they were instructed by, I think, their mom to just pick up whatever bricks they saw on the street. This was back in the 1800s. 1800s? Yeah, 1800s. Pick up whatever bricks they found on the street. And they happened to come across a brickyard and just asked the person in charge of the brickyard, do you have any bricks for us? And they ended up with a whole pallet of bricks. So they thought that was such a great idea. They went to another brickyard and got a whole nother pallet of bricks. And those are the things that if you look at the church building, you look at the church itself, you don't see that right away, but it's, through different people who we don't even remember the names anymore can be used for things like that. The other part is, and similar to that, is not just the simple people serving with their hands, but then also at important times in the church, people serving, or God using the words of different people, pointing back to the faithfulness, pointing back to the truth and the love of the word. And so, included in the booklet that these men have here, they also shared, for example, some of the letters that Pastor Mark Dever wrote to his congregation to provide instruction with some key shepherding points in their church, pointing them back to to God and His Word. And so that was super helpful as well, and that was further emphasized when one of the men who was a previous elder came up, and he gave basically the middle message, which is all about holiness. All the things that they were doing together as a church would not stand if they were not growing in holiness and growing in intimacy with the Lord. And so I think that's just something that we can continue to treasure, is that, ordinary means of grace isn't just all the externals, but it's really a vital relationship with the Lord and treasuring His holiness in our lives and growing in sanctification.
Yeah, I think it was just neat to spend all that time together as just brothers in Christ, and we were talking throughout, and to the best of my knowledge, I don't think anyone thought like, we need to do things differently at our church, or there's this particular thing we should do differently, and I think everything I took away was along the lines of there's opportunity for us to excel still more in the things that we are doing. And just like Teddy mentioned, I think, we're, I'd say like 90% aligned with what they teach there in terms of, the 10% being the congregationalism thing. But, I think, we continue just to be faithful to our calling as Christians and members of the local church. And, in one of the sessions, one of the pastors, his name is Nick Gardner, he was talking about discipleship, and he was kind of talking about different pitfalls in the church. And he talked about the temptation towards professionalism. They have a lot of people on staff that they pay. They have a lot of pastors. And he talked about like the temptation is to kind of think that, they have it, those people have it handled. They're going to do the ministry. But he says, no, that's not like why they hire these people, and that's not what they teach them to do in the church. They say that those pastors are meant to equip the members, but the members are meant to do the ministry. They're meant to be the hands of the body and do the work of the ministry. And so I think like, they talked about why they believe in congregationalism, and they kind of painted a little bit of a caricature of the opposite, which is us. And like they said, in an elder ruled church, like people are sort of laid back, it's more consumer. I don't think that's indicative of our church necessarily. And I think that's just a testament to the high level of involvement that members have. But I think it's just a calling to excel still more. Like there's opportunity for many of us to be thinking proactively about how we can apply our gifts to edify and build up the church, and not necessarily think that the paid pastor or the elders, have it handled. So.
Yeah, just to build on that, like they said, both of these guys, like we share a lot of the same DNA, and what you're seeing there is just, it's been there for 30 years, and so it's more matured. And I agree with what they said. One of the other areas I think that we have an opportunity to grow in, and that you see on it, when you're there, is on a Sunday morning. Well, I can't see into the hearts of like the people who are there, but I sense like a really deep kind of anticipation for what's taking place on a Sunday morning, and a heavy participation by everyone in kind of all elements. Teddy talked about the singing. That's maybe one that stands out a lot because it's quite remarkable, and you get the sense that people aren't afraid of what they sound like. They seek to worship God and encourage one another in the participation in that. And so I would really go beyond the singing. Like I do think we can grow in that, but it's like how coming together on a Sunday morning is a special thing, and it's a thing that is a kind of a supernatural thing. Like it doesn't just take place anywhere, right? It's a special thing that God's kind of set our church aside, created a body for himself, and we're coming to commune with one another and to worship him, and because of the work that he's done. And just like considering more what's actually taking place on a Sunday morning, and that we're not just receiving teaching, but we're participating in that, in every element, from the, like, even just in prayers. I hope we don't kind of just space out during that time. You know, we're being led in prayer, but we're praying together. So all of those things, I think, just can grow in our appreciation and maturity like in Sunday mornings, and our participation as a body together.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. And Steve and Teddy, you know, there's definitely an aspect of coming together, you know, as a people of God that, you know, represents him and allows us to, you know, to participate in the goodness that he's called us into, a family that he's brought us into. And it's not we just come and get our spiritual tank filled and then we go off and do our own thing, but we're participating together in a life, in a body. And that really comes through in all that they do. So that is definitely something I appreciate as well in terms of that. And, you know, that's, you know, they always make the argument that, you know, if you have like a multi-site church and things like that, it's like not really together. You know, you're not gathering together as a church body. And they make it such a huge priority for the togetherness of their congregation. And I hope that's, you know, that's something that we aspire to too. Like, we don't want to be separate as much as possible, but we want to be together. Last question is a little bit more of a catch-all. You know, thank you for faithfully answering the questions, but I want to give you guys the opportunity to, you know, just in what other ways have you been edified and encouraged, in ways that you can encourage our congregation just personally in the time that you had over there? And we don't have to have a prescribed order here, just whenever you guys have something you can share.
I think the one thing that we didn't really talk about is missions. You would think, wrongly, that a ministry that is so focused on church, like, doesn't think about missions at all. I think it's quite the opposite, actually. There was a bunch of people from like Turkey there. We met a missionary from Poland, like countries I had never even heard of. I was like, where is that? And in their members meeting, they gave updates from missionaries that they support or that they've sent out. There's a big emphasis on missions and how it's connected to building healthy churches around the world. That was really encouraging. And, you know, even as, obviously, it's a much larger church, they're going to have more, but I'm encouraged even just to see like, hey, yeah, we're doing similar things here with our missionaries that we support and partner with.
Yeah, I mean, if you really think about it, if you have a strong ecclesiology and a strong high view of the church, you almost have to, be participating in missions because that's how you gather together. If there's no church in place, where's the gathering going to be? So you need to be a part of that work, and that comes through even there. So thanks for sharing that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll share. I was just encouraged by the time over the weekend, but in particular, just having that lunch with the elder pastor and hearing a little bit more behind the scenes. And as they were sharing, just what they've been growing in, and even their thinking behind, for example, the elders meeting and things like that. There's a lot of similarities to what we have here at this church. They had Age of Opportunity under coffee table and things like that. So all of that kind of pointing back to that even though it's in DC, even though it's a church that's maybe older and has different people there, God has richly blessed our church. Just thinking back to all the things that the Lord has brought our church here in San Jose through, in terms of just what we prize and hold dear. The preaching of the word, sharing that with one another, loving one another in Christ. That's not very different than what we saw there. What God has sustained us through and growing our convictions in terms of the seriousness of sin and holiness. Yeah, we're still growing in that, but all believers are. And so just taking away just a great thankfulness for what the Lord has done in this church and is continuing to do. And again, in the context of, we saw a church that's further along. And it's not that one church has to look the same as another. It's just we're all giving thanks to the Lord for the work he's doing in each believer and also each church. And so just continue giving thanks to the Lord for that and looking forward to what the Lord will continue to do in our church.
Yeah, I echo everything that Garrett and Teddy shared. I guess one thing I'll add is, I think there's I think the impact that their faith, individual faith, has on the body. There's obviously a strong emphasis on living out your Christian life in the context of the church, but we also saw just glimpses of how each of them are being faithful just in their own lives, in their workplaces. I was really encouraged by the elder sharing about his evangelism to his coworker, and you see how all of that kind of comes together so that the church is the light of the world. It's a city on a hill when you put all those things together. And even Garrett talked about missions. They have a very unique missions ministry. We were there almost sort of in service of that mission, right? We were people not part of their church, but they want to facilitate a stronger view of the church across other churches, across the world, right? That's missions work. And so you see how the little things that we do here day to day, if we do it together faithfully, it adds up to have this impact that's greater than our individual Christian faith. One of the sessions that they had was they just talked through the church history. But it was cool to hear, Teddy shared one of the stories about these little girls that were collecting bricks. They also shared about this older woman just in the congregation that at one point in their history spoke up for what she believed was true in the Bible, in a members meeting, 50 years ago. And I was thinking, we have members meetings all the time. I can't imagine that. I don't know, being in a book, but it just kind of shows just the little things that we do, the mundane things, as we do them together in the context of our lives in this ministry, in this church. It really has reverberations for the kingdom. And so I think it's just neat to see. It's almost like Back to the Future. You see what all of that put together looks like in the course of 100 years. And that's not how we think about our faith, but maybe that's an encouragement for us to do that.
Well, thank you guys for sharing that. Can we give them a hand for sharing with us and encouraging us? Okay, you guys can go back to your seats. And for the rest of us, I'd like to spend maybe the last 10 minutes or so just praying with one another. AV team, I'm not sure if you got the slides I sent over today. If you did, if you could post those up, great. So what we can do is, what we typically do, maybe like on a second hour, and just with the people that are around us in groups of maybe 4 or 5, let's spend the next 10 minutes or so just praying, and particularly here's some requests that can guide our prayer time. So thank the Lord for providing opportunities for our church members to be equipped and built up. Also pray for wisdom collectively as we as a church apply insights and principles in ways that honor Scripture and serve our local church's specific context, right? We're not just trying to reproduce exactly what they do at Capitol Hill, but really consider who we are as a church, who the Lord has brought here as a church, and how we can best fulfill His calling. Also pray that our church would walk in a manner worthy of the gospel, remain faithful to Christ's calling for His church, and bear the fruit of truth, humility, and unity in our church body. So let's take the next 10 minutes or so to do that, and maybe around 9:30, 9:35, Lyndon, if you're there, if you can come up and do the announcements at that time.